to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad, and today I'll be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. We've been doing a series of episodes here on the podcast that we call the Fuel Pulse Show Back to School. And they're short episodes talking about essential issues for fuel management. And in our previous episode, we talked about fuel sampling. We talked about how where you sample from in a fuel tank can have a big impact on the test results that you get from that sample. Contaminants like water, sediment, microbial contamination, they concentrate themselves at the bottom of the tank, which means if you need to do a test to detect or measure those kind of contaminants, using a top or a middle sample isn't really going to give you useful results. In fact, if you were to make that mistake, that could end up being costly because you would probably just end up getting a false negative reading, which means you would end up not taking action when in fact you have a problem that you do need to take action on. So now that we are clear on that, the question is, where's the best place to take a sample from if you need to have a certain kind of test run? Well, again, where you should sample from depends on what you need to do, what kind of test you intend to have done using that sample. So let's run through some common fuel properties that they test for and see where the best kind of sample would come from to do that test. Okay, first we have 6 tests that we can group together: flash point, distillation, cetane value, viscosity, and cold flow or cloud point. These are all physical properties or combustion property tests. To test for these, a top sample or a middle sample will actually work just fine because these kind of fuel properties, they don't change or vary much from fuel at the top of the tank to the bottom of the tank. They don't vary in the same way that something like water content or sediment content would vary from top of the tank to the bottom. So top or middle are fine for those kind of tests. What about oxidative stability or thermal stability? Well, you could test this with a top or a middle sample, but we would actually defer to using a bottom sample for these because more of the heavier oxidative precursor molecules, more of those are likely to be concentrated down near the bottom of the tank than up near the top. So for stability testing, we prefer a bottom sample for that. Microbial contamination. To do testing for microbial contamination, you definitely want to use a bottom sample for this. But remember, bottom sample does not mean dead bottom right off the bottom. It means 3 to 6 inches from the bottom. Microbes tend to concentrate themselves near the interface between the layer of free water that builds up at the bottom of the tank and the fuel above it. So ideally, when you're doing a sample, taking a sample, you want to try and get some of that interface between the 2 layers in your sample. And then a good testing technician will see that, and they will use that in their microbial testing to try and give you the most accurate results. Water and sediment testing and water by Carl Fisher testing. For these very important tests, you need to use a bottom sample. Middle samples or top samples, they're simply not going to give you the diagnostic value that you need because your water content tends to be concentrated again down near the bottom. And so you need a sample from an area where that's going to be more likely to reflect that. Okay, so we know now where to take samples from. What about how to take samples? Well, there are 2, I would say, broad categories of ways to take a sample. Now, let's say you have an AST, an above ground storage tank. And let's say it has a sampling port on the outside. Well, you could just simply take a sample from that, put it directly into your sampling container. You could do that. That kind of sample, if you were to do that, likely would qualify as a middle sample, depending on exactly how far up from the bottom that the port's pickup is. But we would actually recommend not using a sampling port like that, because if you do, you don't have any control over exactly how far down or exactly where your sample's actually coming from. What you really need to do, and this would be the recommendation, what you really need to do is you need to use a fuel sampler, sometimes known in the industry as a bacon bomb. Now, a bacon bomb is a non-sparking metal cylinder, and it looks something like this. And this is probably the most commonly used thing for taking fuel samples in the industry. So you would lower it down the fuel, and what it's going to have rope that's going to attach here, and it's going to have another piece of rope that attaches elsewhere. And so you're going to use the rope to lower it down into your fuel depth from the top of the tank. And once you got it where you want it to be, you're going to pull the string, and it's going to open this chamber at the bottom, and your sample is going to rush up and fill a chamber that's inside of here. Then when you've got it, you pull it up, and then you open it and you empty that sample into a clean sampling container. Now, speaking of depth, how do you get a fuel sampler to the depth that you need? There are a couple of ways to do that. Now, if you have a conventional bacon bomb like this one, you would use a tank measuring stick to first measure the depth of the tank from the port that you're going to be lowering down. See how far down that depth is. Now, once you have that measurement with your measuring stick, you can mark off on that cord how far down you need to lower it so that it settles in the bottom middle or the middle or 6 inches off the bottom or however you need it to be. Conversely, let's say you're doing a bottom sample. You need to do a bottom sample. You know that you want to get it 3 to 6 inches. What you can actually do is you can lower it down until you feel it hit the bottom of the tank. Then what you would do is you could then raise it back up 3 to 6 inches, and you got it at the right height. So there are a number of ways to do it that way. There is, however, an easier way even than that to do it, and that is to have a bacon bomb that actually has attachments that screw into the end. Now, one of the ones that, let's say, Bell Performance has, it has specially designed attachments that are of differing lengths. It has a 3-inch attachment, a 6-inch attachment, and a 12-inch attachment. And so let's say you need to do a sample 6 inches off the bottom. You would take the 6-inch attachment and you would actually screw it into the bottom. And then when you lower it down, when it hits the bottom, it's at 6 inches. It's at exactly the right height that you need it to be at. And so you're going to get good consistency with your results. Okay, so that's the best way to take a sample. Now, what about some other considerations? Well, definitely you want to use clean sample containers for your fuel sample so that you don't contaminate them. This is especially important if you're doing testing for microbial contamination. Now, typically a mason jar actually will work just fine for this. And a mason jar is actually better to use than one of those less clear plastic sample containers if you want to be able to see your sample and do, let's say, an ASTM visual inspection, because glass is actually the preferred medium for looking through, because it gives you a better view of whether the fuel is clean or bright. It's also a good idea, and this is more of a logistics thing, it's also a good idea to pre-label your sample containers before you start, because when you're elbow deep in working in stuff on the top of a tank, the less you have to worry about doing, the better. And if you're taking a sample that you intend to have microbial testing done on it, the recommendation would be take the sample, put it on ice in a cooler until you get back to a place, till you get out of the field and you get back to a place where you have a refrigerator. You can stash the sample in the refrigerator until you're ready to send it off for testing. Because the object there is you want to preserve the microbial population in your sample as much as possible. The best way to do that is to keep your sample cold. Okay, last thing we want to talk about. Remember earlier we ran through different fuel tests and we discussed the best place in the tank to sample from if you were going to have a particular kind of test done. We said a cetane test sample could be done well from a top sample or a middle sample. A water and sediment test, you really needed a bottom sample. But what if, What if you're pulling a sample to have a bunch of different kinds of tests done? Let's say you have a yearly test slate that involves a bunch of these different kinds of tests. uh, you only want to submit one sample. So, what's the best place to pull from to do that kind of test slate? Well, for that kind of situation, we would default to a bottom sample, 3 to 6 inches from the bottom. That kind of sample is going to have the best diagnostic value, all kinds of testing considered. If you do that, you'll be all right. And so that's going to do it for today's Fuel Pulse Show Back to School quick dive into the issue of fuel sampling, how to sample, and how to handle your samples for testing. If you like what you heard, you haven't done so already, feel free to subscribe at your podcast platform of choice, whether that's iTunes, Stitcher, Amazon Podcasts, wherever you happen to like to listen. And leave us a review if you can, because that really does help people find us. So until next time, I'm Erik Bjornstad. Thank you for joining us. And I'll see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.